It was the kind of night that college students in Riverside, California, would normally remember with nothing more than a yawn the next morning. The middle of September had that stillness to it, when the air turned slightly cooler but the summer heat still lingered in the walls of the campus apartments. Students were just settling into the new academic year, routines still fresh, excitement and nervous energy woven into everything they did. But for one young woman, 20-year-old Natalie Morgan, that night would never fade into memory. It would become the tragic endpoint of her life, and the beginning of a mystery that shook an entire community. Natalie had always been the bright one in her family. Born and raised in Texas before her family moved west, she carried herself with quiet confidence. Friends described her as both disciplined and warm, the type who excelled in her sociology classes during the day, then made time in the evening to volunteer at a local animal rescue center. She had recently adopted a tiny chihuahua she named Bella, a fragile but spirited little dog that quickly became her constant shadow. Natalie lived for routines, for order, for being dependable in a world that often spun out of control. That semester, her last year at the University of Riverside, Natalie finally moved out of the dorms and into a student apartment leased by her sorority. To her, it felt like a milestone, a step closer to independence, a place she could call her own. She decorated her room with small photographs of her family, a worn but beloved blanket from childhood, and a desk cluttered with Spanish flashcards she used for practice. She had dreams of traveling after graduation, maybe to South America, where she could put her language skills to real use. For now, though, she was content. She had friends down the hall, a community that supported her, and a future that seemed wide open. On the evening of September 18, 2016, the apartment was alive with chatter and laughter. Recruitment season for the sorority was in full swing. That meant signs to paint, decorations to hang, schedules to finalize. Natalie and her friends spent hours cutting colored paper, arranging candles, and rehearsing introductions they would make to new members. It was hard work, but the kind of work that forged closeness. The girls teased one another, shared snacks, and snapped photos on their phones as the hours ticked by. By 3 in the morning, most of them had retreated to their rooms, exhausted. Natalie stayed in the common area a little longer, talking with her friend Olivia Hayes, who had recently returned from a late-night drive to drop her boyfriend at the airport. The two young women sat on the couch, their voices dropping into the kind of drowsy rhythm that comes when fatigue softens conversation. At some point, Natalie drifted to sleep there. Around 3:30, she stirred awake, gathered Bella into her arms and walked back to her room. Olivia later remembered hearing her door close softly, the sound blending into the silence of the apartment. The quiet did not last. Just 2 hours later, Olivia was startled awake by a noise that sliced through her sleep like a knife. A scream, sharp, terrified, unmistakably female, echoed from below her room. At the same time, Bella's frantic barking rose from the lower floor, high-pitched and desperate. Olivia sat upright, heart pounding. She reached for her phone and dialed Natalie, but the call rang unanswered. Fear crept into her chest. She hesitated only a moment before making another call, this time to the police. When officers arrived, the building appeared undisturbed. The front door was locked, windows intact. Inside, most of the sorority members still slept soundly, oblivious to anything unusual. The officers did a quick walkthrough, shining their flashlights in corners, but found no signs of a break-in, no overturned furniture, no lingering screams. To them, it seemed possible that the noise had been a nightmare, or maybe students roughhousing outside. Without stronger evidence, they chose not to disturb the rest of the residents. They reassured Olivia and left the scene. What happened in those next few minutes remains one of the most haunting questions in the entire case. Not long after the patrol car disappeared into the night, Olivia heard it again. A crash, this time loud and violent, from downstairs. She rushed to her balcony. Smoke was already curling from Natalie's window, a dark plume spreading upward, followed by the unmistakable flicker of flames. Olivia's heart seized. But it wasn't just the fire that froze her in place. She saw movement, a figure climbing out of Natalie's window. The man was wrapped in a red blanket, his face partly obscured, but his shape, his movements, burned themselves into Olivia's memory. He jumped to the ground and sprinted into the shadows, vanishing before she could even scream. Panic flooded the apartment as fire alarms shrieked. Girls stumbled from their rooms, coughing, calling each other's names. Someone tried to open Natalie's door, but it was locked tight. That alone was strange. None of them locked their doors at night. An extra key finally forced it open, only for the group to be driven back by a wave of smoke and heat. Through the haze, they glimpsed a figure lying still on the bed. The flames grew too fast and they had no choice but to retreat. By the time firefighters arrived, the building was nearly engulfed. Students huddled on the street, clutching each other, their faces streaked with tears and soot. It took crews more than 15 minutes to battle the blaze. When they finally pushed into Natalie's room, the damage was catastrophic. On the bed lay a body, burned so badly it could not be recognized by sight alone. Nearby, curled against the frame, they found Bella. The tiny chihuahua was alive, barely, and was rushed to a veterinary clinic. Word spread across the campus almost instantly. By dawn, thousands of students knew that something terrible had happened at the Delta Phi apartment. Many assumed it was a tragic accident, a candle left burning, faulty wiring. But when investigators sifted through the ashes, the evidence told a different story. A story that revealed malice, violence, and a crime far darker than anyone first imagined. This was not the end of Natalie Morgan's story. It was only the beginning. What detectives were about to uncover would lead them down a twisting path, one filled with false alibis, hidden evidence, and the chilling realization that the killer had been there, inside the room, while officers stood just outside. When the flames finally gave way to the hiss of water hoses, silence fell over the Riverside apartment complex. Smoke drifted lazily into the pre-dawn sky, leaving behind the acrid stench of charred wood and melted plastic. Firefighters moved cautiously through the blackened wreckage, their boots crunching over debris, their flashlights cutting narrow beams through the haze. It didn't take long before the unthinkable was confirmed. On the bed inside the gutted room lay a body, burned almost beyond recognition. For a brief moment, some of the girls huddled outside clung to the hope that maybe it wasn't Natalie, that somehow she had escaped. But within minutes, the grim reality settled in. The room belonged to her. She had not made it out. The firefighters carried out something else too. Bella, Natalie's little chihuahua. The dog clung to life but was badly weakened, coughing and trembling in the arms of a paramedic. It was a small glimmer of hope in a night filled with devastation. Yet the survival of the dog raised its own questions. If Bella had lived through the fire, why hadn't Natalie? At first, many assumed it was an accident. Student housing was notorious for candles left burning, overloaded extension cords, or careless cooking. The university had seen minor incidents before. But this fire felt different to the men and women trained to spot its patterns. Something about the scene did not sit right. Inside the room, investigators noticed a strange detail. A plastic trash bin sitting directly on top of the bed, its frame warped and blackened from the flames. That in itself was suspicious. Fire rarely starts in the middle of a mattress, and almost never with a trash can conveniently placed there. It looked staged, deliberate. The questions multiplied when the forensic team took a closer look at the floor. Pools of dark residue had seeped into the carpet and scorched wood. At first glance, it might have been dismissed as melted material. But tests quickly revealed it for what it was: blood. That finding changed everything. A simple accident could not explain blood spread across the bed and floor. And as the coroner's office began its examination, the picture grew darker still. At the Riverside County Medical Examiner's facility, the body was carefully examined. The flames had destroyed fingerprints, and the face was beyond recognition. Dental records had to be used to confirm what everyone already feared. The victim was Natalie Morgan. But what stunned even seasoned examiners was the violence written into her remains. Beneath the burns, they found 19 stab wounds driven deep into her torso and arms. Some were clustered near the chest, others scattered along her sides. The pattern suggested a struggle, a frantic attempt to fight back against an attacker who would not stop. Equally telling was what the lungs revealed. There was no soot, no trace of smoke inhalation. Natalie had not died in the fire. She had been dead before the flames ever touched her. This detail reframed the entire tragedy. The blaze had not killed her. It had been set to erase the evidence of what had already happened. Whoever had done this hadn't just murdered a young woman, they had tried to burn away the truth. With confirmation that Natalie's death was homicide, detectives from the Riverside Police Department's Major Crimes Unit took over the case. They moved quickly, sealing off the building and interviewing every resident. The young women in the sorority were distraught, many still in shock from the night before. But their testimonies were crucial. Piece by piece, a timeline began to emerge. Olivia Hayes repeated what she had told police earlier. The scream, Bella's barking, the man she had glimpsed near the stairwell hours before the fire, and finally, the haunting sight of him leaping from Natalie's burning window wrapped in a red blanket. She recalled his clothing: dark t-shirt, jeans, a black cap, and the way he had bolted the moment she noticed him. Several other girls confirmed seeing smoke and flames erupt from Natalie's room and remembered trying to get in, only to find the door locked. That struck detectives as odd. In sorority housing, doors were almost never locked, especially at night when friends came and went freely. Whoever had been in that room had taken steps to keep others out. Outside, firefighters and police canvassed the area. Neighbors described a chaotic scene, students fleeing, alarms blaring, but one witness, a student living across the street, mentioned something that stood out. In the early hours of the morning, just as the fire broke out, he had seen a red Nissan pulling away from the curb. On the back window he noticed stickers with the letters of a fraternity. It wasn't enough to name a suspect, but it was a lead. In an investigation that had started with flames and ashes, even the smallest thread could prove vital. As news spread across campus, the atmosphere shifted from grief to fear. A memorial of candles and flowers grew outside the charred apartment building, where students left notes and photographs of Natalie. Professors paused classes to acknowledge her death. But beneath the mourning ran an undercurrent of anxiety. If someone had broken into Natalie's room and killed her, who else might be at risk? Was this random or had she been targeted? Was the intruder someone from campus, or an outsider who had slipped through the cracks of student life? University administrators issued statements promising full cooperation with police and heightened security. Patrol cars began circling the area more frequently. But for Natalie's family, who flew in from Texas within days, none of that mattered. Their daughter was gone, and the way she had been taken from them left wounds deeper than anyone could see. Detectives chased the most obvious lead first, the red Nissan with fraternity markings. They questioned members of every fraternity chapter on campus. Dozens of young men were called in, their cars inspected. Some admitted to driving red vehicles, but none matched the exact description. The license plate, unfortunately, had not been captured by witnesses. It was a setback, but investigators weren't discouraged. Arson murder cases often unfolded slowly, requiring patience. And in this case there were too many strange details to ignore. The trash bin on the bed. The locked door. The screams that brought police there before the fire ever started. Each pointed to an intruder who had stayed hidden in Natalie's room, waiting out the officers, and then struck when the coast was clear. That fact alone unsettled detectives. It meant the killer had been bold, calculating, and unafraid of proximity to law enforcement. By the end of that week, the case had moved far beyond the simple question of how a fire had started. Investigators were now certain. Natalie Morgan had been murdered. The only question was by whom. And the answer, when it finally came, would reveal a web of lies, stolen objects, and a suspect who thought he could burn away the truth. Detectives knew from experience that the first days of an investigation could define the entire case. Time eroded evidence, blurred memories, and emboldened suspects. So they returned to the testimonies of those who had been closest to the scene, determined to wring out every possible detail. Olivia Hayes once again sat in a small interview room, her hands trembling as she recounted what she had seen. It was the same story she had told before, but now, in the sterile quiet of the police station, it took on greater weight. She described hearing the scream and Bella's frantic barking. She described looking out her window at 5:30 that morning and seeing a man standing at the bottom of the stairwell. He had startled when she noticed him, then darted away. Hours later, she swore it was the same man who leapt from Natalie's burning room wrapped in a red blanket. The detectives pressed her on details. What was he wearing? Olivia was clear: jeans, a dark t-shirt, and a black baseball cap. She couldn't see his face in the shadows, but the clothing stuck with her. And then she added something else. When he ran from the fire, he disappeared into the darkness, and moments later, she heard the roar of an engine. Peering into the street, she glimpsed a red Nissan speeding off. Across its back windshield were 3 large Greek letters, the unmistakable mark of a fraternity. That single observation opened a floodgate. Riverside was a college town, saturated with fraternities and their symbols plastered on t-shirts, flags, and car stickers. It was entirely possible that the Nissan belonged to someone unconnected to the crime. But detectives also knew that the tiniest lead could prove decisive. They cataloged the information carefully: red Nissan, fraternity sticker, male driver wrapped in a red blanket. For several days, investigators focused on fraternities in the area. Dozens of young men were brought in, their vehicles photographed, their whereabouts for that night scrutinized. Some bristled at the questioning, insisting they had nothing to do with a sorority fire. Others seemed frightened but offered nothing useful. And still none of the cars matched. It was frustrating work, like sifting sand for a single gold fleck. Just as the investigation threatened to stall, another report came in that shifted everything. On the same night of the fire, a group of students living across the street had experienced a break-in. Someone had forced their back door and stolen several items: a laptop, a backpack, a Bluetooth speaker, and a handful of smaller electronics. At first, detectives hesitated. College neighborhoods weren't strangers to theft. A drunken partygoer might easily walk off with something that wasn't theirs. But then they realized the timing was uncanny. The burglary had happened within hours of Natalie's murder, less than a block away. Could the same man responsible for her death also have taken part in the theft? The answer began to reveal itself when they examined the list of stolen items. The Bluetooth speaker stood out. Unlike a laptop that could be wiped and resold, the speaker required new users to register it online before pairing with their devices. That registration would leave a digital trail. Detectives wasted no time. They contacted the manufacturer, provided the speaker's serial number, and asked for an alert if anyone tried to activate it. Days passed with no activity. But then a notification pinged their system. The stolen speaker had just been registered to an internet address in Fresno, California, about 3 hours north of Riverside. The lead was electrifying. Police traced the IP address to a modest apartment belonging to a man named Daniel Cruz, a graduate student at Fresno State University. When detectives arrived at his door, Daniel was visibly shaken. He admitted the speaker was in his apartment, but he insisted it wasn't his. According to Daniel, his roommate Adrian Flores had brought it home days earlier. Adrian, 22, was also a student at Fresno State. He had told Daniel that he'd been down in Los Angeles for a show and came back with a pile of random things: dishes, bottles, and the Bluetooth speaker among them. When Daniel asked where it all came from, Adrian shrugged and said a friend had given him stuff they didn't want anymore. The story sounded thin, and detectives had heard enough alibis to recognize one. But Daniel's unease seemed genuine. He even handed over the speaker willingly, hoping to prove he had nothing to hide. With that, detectives had a new name. Adrian Flores wasn't in Riverside's system, had no prior record, and nothing tied him directly to Natalie yet. But the coincidence was too strong. A man in Riverside during the same weekend, returning to Fresno with stolen property from a burglary that happened the very night Natalie was murdered. The team now faced a delicate choice. They could move too quickly, arrest Adrian without enough evidence, and risk the case collapsing in court. Or they could watch, wait, and build a chain of proof so strong it could not be denied. They chose patience. Surveillance units were assigned to Fresno. Officers watched Adrian's apartment, tracked his car, and noted his routines. He drove an older red Nissan, the detail that made detectives' pulses quicken. And on the rear windshield, they saw it: Greek letters from a fraternity chapter Adrian had once joined. Piece by piece, the fragments began to align. Olivia's description. The witness who saw the Nissan speeding away. The burglary across the street. The stolen speaker activated from Adrian's own apartment. Still, detectives needed more. Circumstance was not conviction. They knew a prosecutor would demand hard evidence: DNA, blood, fingerprints, video, something irrefutable. And so, they prepared to bring Adrian in for questioning, hoping the pressure of an interrogation would crack open the truth. But before that could happen, word of Natalie's death continued to spread through the Riverside community. Her friends, her professors, even students who had never spoken to her came forward with grief-stricken stories of how kind she had been, how diligent, how much she had loved Bella. A makeshift memorial on the campus lawn grew larger by the day. Photographs of Natalie, smiling in happier times, stood beside candles that flickered against the night. Her parents, Richard and Helen, stood before the crowd at a vigil, their faces etched with sorrow. They thanked the community for their support but pleaded for patience as the investigation continued. In their hearts, they carried a silent question that no one yet could answer: who could possibly want to harm their daughter? The detectives, meanwhile, felt the weight of those same questions. They had followed the trail from smoke and blood to a stolen speaker hundreds of miles away. Now the investigation pointed squarely at Adrian Flores. But the hardest work was still ahead: unraveling the truth from his lies and proving once and for all what had happened in Natalie Morgan's room. On the morning of September 26, 2016, detectives finally made their move. After days of watching Adrian Flores's routines in Fresno, his trips to class, his late-night drives, the way he seemed restless and distracted, they decided it was time to bring him in. Patrol units surrounded the small apartment complex where he lived. As the sun climbed over the horizon, officers knocked firmly on the door. Adrian answered in a rumpled t-shirt and jeans. He looked confused, half awake, but not entirely surprised. Detectives later recalled that his eyes darted past them toward the parking lot, where his red Nissan sat in plain view. That glance alone spoke volumes. Within minutes, Adrian was in handcuffs, seated in the back of a cruiser headed to the station. The interrogation began like so many others, with small talk. Detectives asked about his classes, his job, his hobbies. Adrian was cautious, offering short answers, his body leaning back as if to create distance. When the conversation shifted to the weekend of September 18th, his tone sharpened. He admitted he had been in Los Angeles, but claimed the trip was innocent. A concert, some parties, nothing more. He insisted he had not been near Riverside and had no idea where Natalie Morgan's sorority house even was. The detectives listened patiently, nodding, then slid photographs across the table. The Bluetooth speaker recovered from his apartment. Adrian frowned. He said the speaker wasn't his. He said a friend from Los Angeles had given it to him. When pressed for a name, he hesitated, then muttered something about an acquaintance he barely knew. The story was thin, but detectives let it hang in the air. They had learned long ago that silence was sometimes more effective than confrontation. When the quiet stretched, Adrian shifted again. This time he said he had gone to a party near Riverside with his friend Ethan Delgado. They had been drinking, he explained, and at some point Ethan left with a girl he had just met. Adrian claimed he didn't remember much after that, only that he ended up with a bag of items someone had left behind. The speaker, the dishes, the bottles, it was all junk, he said, things no one else wanted. The detectives noted the change. First, the items were gifts from a friend. Now, they were leftovers from a stranger's move. They asked Adrian why he had told two different stories. He shrugged, his mouth tightening. I was tired, he said. I didn't remember exactly. As the hours passed, the contradictions piled up. Confronted with the fact that his own roommate had seen him return home alone with the speaker and other items, Adrian quickly adjusted his account once again. This time he admitted he had taken them himself, lifting the speaker and laptop from an unlocked house after a party. It was stupid, he said, just a drunken mistake. Nothing more. But detectives weren't convinced. They pointed out that the burglary happened within the same block as Natalie Morgan's apartment. They asked him why he had been there at all. Adrian leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly, and spun another story. He claimed that as he and Ethan left the party, a man hiding near a dumpster confronted them with a gun. According to Adrian, the man fired shots when they ran, forcing them to scatter. He suggested that maybe this man was the one who had killed Natalie. The officers exchanged glances. No neighbors had reported hearing gunshots that night. And Adrian's description of the supposed gunman matched almost word for word the details Olivia had given of the man she saw outside the sorority building. It was as though Adrian had borrowed her testimony and bent it to fit his own defense. When pressed further, Adrian's shoulders sagged. He buried his face in his hands, sat silently for a moment, then whispered, "All right, it wasn't me. It was Ethan." He claimed Ethan had left the party with a girl who matched Natalie's description. Minutes later, Ethan returned in a panic, insisting they had to leave immediately. Adrian said he had seen Ethan throw away a pair of rubber gloves as they fled. He even admitted that when news of Natalie's death broke, he confronted Ethan by text message, and Ethan supposedly confessed. To the detectives, it was a familiar tactic: deflection. Adrian had shifted blame from strangers to friends, changing his story whenever one version collapsed under scrutiny. Yet each retelling revealed more knowledge than an innocent person should have had. He mentioned the gloves before police had ever disclosed that detail. He slipped and called Natalie by name, though he had claimed not to know her. Investigators knew they were close, but they also knew not to push too hard too fast. Instead, they decided to widen the net. If Adrian insisted Ethan was involved, then Ethan would be brought in too. And if Adrian's lies continued to tangle, the truth would eventually surface. Meanwhile, forensic teams combed through Adrian's life. They examined his Nissan, scraping fibers and swabbing for traces. They collected his clothing, some of which appeared hastily washed. They even searched his trash, where they found a red blanket matching Olivia's description, stained with what looked like dried blood. Each discovery pressed Adrian further into a corner. Yet in the interview room, he clung to his shifting narratives as though one version might finally stick. The detectives, seasoned in the art of patience, simply recorded it all. They knew that when the time came, they would use his own words against him. Back in Riverside, the campus remained on edge. Rumors spread with the speed of wildfire. Whispers of a stranger seen lurking near the sorority houses, of a car speeding away before dawn, of fraternity ties that no one could quite confirm. Students locked their doors more carefully, checked over their shoulders walking home at night. For them, the horror of Natalie's death was not just a story on the news, it was a shadow cast over their daily lives. For Natalie's parents, the pain deepened. They attended briefings with investigators, their faces tight with grief as they learned the truth piece by piece. Their daughter had not died in an accident. She had been attacked, stabbed, and her body set aflame in a calculated attempt to erase the evidence. That knowledge cut deeper than anything the flames had destroyed. The investigation was far from over. Adrian Flores sat in custody, his stories unraveling, his lies circling back on themselves. But detectives knew this was only the beginning. Somewhere within the tangle of shifting accounts lay the truth. And to find it, they would have to pull apart every thread, every inconsistency, until the real sequence of events finally stood bare. The detectives had heard enough shifting stories from Adrian Flores. Every time he opened his mouth, a new version spilled out. One that contradicted the last, one that placed the blame anywhere but on himself. But investigators knew that words could only go so far. What mattered now was evidence, the kind that could not be twisted or explained away. They began with his car. Adrian's red Nissan had been parked outside his Fresno apartment when he was arrested, the same vehicle Olivia Hayes described fleeing from the scene of the fire. To most passers-by, it looked ordinary, an aging sedan with fraternity letters peeling across the back windshield. But to detectives, it was a possible crime scene on wheels. The forensic team descended on it with gloves and kits, photographing every angle before a single door was opened. They swabbed the steering wheel, the seats, the trunk. When ultraviolet lights swept across the upholstery, dark stains bloomed into view. Samples were collected immediately. Later, laboratory testing confirmed what investigators feared. The stains were blood. Further analysis would link it directly to Natalie Morgan. It wasn't just the car. Inside Adrian's apartment, a search warrant granted them access to every drawer, closet, and corner. What they found painted a chilling picture. In a plastic trash bag shoved against the wall of his bedroom, they uncovered a folded red blanket, its fibers singed, its surface smeared with dried reddish-brown stains. Next to it lay a pair of jeans and a dark t-shirt, both appearing hastily washed, but with faint traces of blood that clung despite the attempt to erase them. And in the same bag rested a knife, the blade dulled from use but still marked with specks that laboratory tests later confirmed to be Natalie's blood. The discovery was damning, but it also revealed something about Adrian's mindset. He hadn't discarded the items far away, hadn't buried them or burned them beyond recognition. Instead, he had bundled them into a bag and left them in his own apartment, as though denial itself could serve as protection. Detectives often said that arrogance was the downfall of many criminals. Here, it seemed almost willful, an assumption that no one would ever tie him to Riverside. As the evidence piled up, detectives also searched the Nissan more carefully. In the trunk, alongside fast food wrappers and school papers, they found fibers that matched the red blanket. In the grooves of the floor mats, more blood traces lingered. Each detail layered onto the case, creating a chain that connected Adrian to Natalie's apartment inescapably. Meanwhile, back in Riverside, the timeline of the crime was becoming clearer. Investigators now believed Adrian had broken into Natalie's apartment through the balcony in the early morning hours. Whether his intention had been burglary or something more sinister was uncertain, but when Natalie awoke and screamed, he panicked. In those violent minutes that followed, she was stabbed repeatedly. Bella's barking echoed through the apartment, but the others, still asleep, never realized what was unfolding downstairs. The fire had been his attempt to cover it all. By placing the trash can on Natalie's bed and setting it alight, Adrian must have thought the flames would consume every trace of what had happened. But the plan failed. Instead, the fire drew firefighters and police, who preserved the very evidence he hoped to destroy. In Fresno, detectives confronted Adrian again after the discoveries in his apartment and car. This time, the photographs they placed on the table carried more weight than any accusation. Images of the red blanket, the knife, the blood-stained clothing, all laid bare in glossy color. Adrian's face hardened. He rubbed his temples, shook his head, but offered no clear explanation. He muttered about being drunk, about not remembering, about Ethan Delgado having more involvement than him. Yet his eyes betrayed the pressure of the net closing in. For investigators, the shifting of blame was familiar. Adrian had already tried to pin the crime on strangers, then on Ethan. But now the physical evidence spoke louder than his words. The blanket was his. The car was his. The knife had been found in his room. Each link tethered him tighter to the crime. Outside the interrogation room, prosecutors began drafting their case. The motive remained hazy, Was it a burglary gone wrong or something darker? But in court, motive was often less important than means and opportunity. Adrian had both, and the trail of blood in his possessions was nearly impossible to refute. Even so, the detectives pressed on, hungry for a fuller picture. They canvassed Adrian's acquaintances in Fresno. Some remembered him bragging about parties, about reckless nights. But one neighbor told a story that chilled them. A day after Adrian returned from Riverside, he had spoken casually about a student killed in a fire near a sorority. He described details, stabbing, burning, even the layout of the room, that had never been released publicly. According to the neighbor, Adrian laughed, calling it a clean job that police would never solve. Those words sealed his fate. It wasn't just evidence in bags and cars anymore. It was a confession of sorts, delivered to someone he assumed would never repeat it. Back in Riverside, the news of Adrian's arrest spread across campus. Relief mingled with sorrow. For many students, knowing a suspect was in custody lifted the fear that had shadowed their days since Natalie's death. But for Natalie's family, grief remained sharp. They stood at a press conference, thanking detectives for their relentless work, their voices breaking as they remembered their daughter. Detectives, hardened by years of such cases, admitted quietly among themselves that this one felt different. Maybe it was the senselessness of it. A bright young woman on the edge of adulthood, her life cut short by someone she didn't even know. Or maybe it was the way Adrian had tried to erase her existence with fire, only to leave behind the very evidence that condemned him. By the end of the week, the case file against Adrian Flores had grown thick. Witness testimony, forensic reports, photographs of evidence, timelines reconstructed to the minute. The red Nissan, once just a fleeting glimpse in the dark, had become a cornerstone of proof. The blanket, the knife, the blood, all threads in a tapestry of guilt. Adrian remained in custody, awaiting trial. But detectives knew their work wasn't over. Ethan Delgado's role lingered on the edges, his presence at the party and in the Nissan raising questions. Had he known what Adrian was about to do? Had he seen more than he admitted? Those questions would carry into the next phase of the case. For now, though, one truth was clear. The attempt to burn away the evidence had failed. Instead, it had illuminated Adrian Flores as the man who carried violence into Natalie Morgan's room, leaving behind a trail of fire and blood that no denial could erase. Even with the mountain of evidence against Adrian Flores, detectives could not shake the feeling that another shadow lingered in the background. Every time Adrian opened his mouth, he dragged another name into the story. Sometimes it was a faceless gunman by a dumpster. Other times it was his roommate or a stranger at a party. But the name that kept surfacing, no matter how often the story shifted, was Ethan Delgado. Ethan was 23, a student as well, and by all outward appearances, a far less complicated figure than Adrian. He had grown up in Fresno, enrolled at the state university, and kept mostly to himself. Friends described him as quiet, even shy, the kind of person who rarely pushed back when louder personalities took charge. That passivity, detectives suspected, was the very reason Adrian kept pointing fingers in his direction. The first interview with Ethan was cautious. He admitted that he and Adrian had been in Riverside together the weekend of the fire. They had gone to a party, drunk too much, and eventually made their way back north. But when asked about the break-in, the fire, or Natalie Morgan, Ethan's responses were vague. He insisted he knew nothing about a murder and looked visibly shaken when detectives told him the full scope of what had happened. At first glance, Ethan's confusion could have been genuine. Yet there were details that made investigators wary. A witness had seen a red Nissan parked near Natalie's building around the time of the fire, with someone sitting inside. If that was true, then Ethan may not have been entirely innocent. Even if he hadn't wielded the knife, he might have acted as lookout or getaway driver. To test his story, detectives decided to press him with evidence. They showed him photographs of the red blanket, the knife, and Natalie's blood found in Adrian's car. Ethan's face drained of color. He shook his head, repeating again and again that he had nothing to do with it. He admitted to riding in the Nissan, yes, but swore he never entered the sorority house. It was the kind of half-confession investigators expected. Admitting to being present but not to participating was a way of minimizing responsibility. The challenge was proving what role Ethan had truly played. As the case moved forward, prosecutors weighed their options. Adrian's guilt seemed undeniable. His DNA, his car, his belongings all tied him to the murder. But Ethan's involvement was murkier. Was he an accomplice who knew exactly what was happening? Or was he simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, too frightened to stop a friend spiraling into violence? To answer that, detectives dug deeper into the timeline. A key witness came forward, a man who had been collecting recyclables near Natalie's apartment in the early morning hours of September 19th. He remembered being approached by a stranger who asked if he could fight. The encounter unsettled him, and moments later he saw the same man walking toward the sorority house. Nearby, he noticed a red Nissan parked with someone in the driver's seat. When shown photographs, the witness identified the man who approached him as Adrian Flores. And the man in the car? That was Ethan. The account clarified what detectives had long suspected. Adrian had gone into Natalie's apartment alone, while Ethan remained in the Nissan. Whether Ethan knew the plan beforehand was still uncertain, but his role as lookout or driver was undeniable. Prosecutors decided to charge them both, though differently. Adrian faced murder, arson, burglary, and animal cruelty. Ethan, on the other hand, was charged with being an accessory and with burglary connected to the stolen speaker and laptop. The distinction mattered. It meant Ethan could potentially negotiate a plea, while Adrian would face the full weight of the evidence. In 2017, as the case wound through preliminary hearings, Ethan's defense team struck a deal. They argued that he had no knowledge Adrian planned to attack anyone. He was guilty of theft, yes, but not murder. The prosecution agreed to separate his trial from Adrian's and to reduce his charges. Ethan pled guilty to being an accessory after the fact and to burglary. His sentence, 2 years and 8 months in prison. For some, the outcome felt too light. Natalie's parents struggled with the idea that someone who had been present that night would serve less than 3 years while their daughter was gone forever. But prosecutors explained that the deal was necessary. Securing Ethan's testimony about Adrian's actions strengthened their primary case. And with the physical evidence already overwhelming, they wanted no distractions in convicting the man who had wielded the knife. Adrian's case, meanwhile, grew heavier. The evidence file was a fortress. Blood analysis, witness testimony, surveillance footage, and the chilling items pulled from his trash bag. Every attempt to shift blame onto Ethan collapsed under scrutiny. And every word Ethan spoke in his own hearings only tied Adrian closer to the crime. Detectives who had worked the case from the beginning reflected on the dynamic between the two men. Adrian was the aggressor, impulsive and reckless, but also arrogant enough to think he could outsmart investigators. Ethan was the follower, caught in the orbit of someone stronger, too weak to resist and too fearful to intervene. Together, they had stepped into Riverside as ordinary college kids. By the time they left, one young woman was dead, and both of their lives were permanently shattered. As the years turned, the stage was set for Adrian's trial. Families prepared themselves for painful testimony. Prosecutors rehearsed their arguments. Defense attorneys searched desperately for cracks in the wall of evidence. Through it all, Ethan sat quietly in prison, serving his reduced sentence, his name fading from headlines even as Adrian's loomed larger. But in the minds of Natalie's family, the roles were clear. Adrian had taken their daughter's life. Ethan had watched from the car. Both had choices and both had failed her. The case now moved toward its climax. With Ethan's charges settled, the focus sharpened entirely on Adrian Flores. The trial promised to be brutal, not just in evidence but in the questions it would force everyone to confront. Why Natalie, why that night, and why a man would choose to smother the truth with fire instead of facing his own reflection. By the fall of 2018, nearly 2 years after the fire that tore through a Riverside sorority house, the case of Adrian Flores finally came before a jury. The courtroom was crowded from the start. Rows of students sat shoulder to shoulder beside reporters with notebooks, while Natalie Morgan's family filled the front row. Her parents, Richard and Helen, looked worn but resolute, their grief now hardened into determination. They had waded through investigation, pretrial hearings, and delays. At last, they would see the man accused of killing their daughter held to account. Adrian entered the room in a plain suit provided by his defense team. He looked smaller somehow, his posture slouched, his eyes darting to the floor. For a man once so arrogant that he had boasted about details of the crime to a neighbor, his silence now was striking. The charges read against him were devastating. Murder, arson, burglary, and animal cruelty for the death of Bella. He faced life without the possibility of parole. The prosecution laid out their case methodically. They showed photographs of the burned bedroom, the twisted trash bin on the bed, and the pools of blood that proved Natalie had been stabbed before the fire. They displayed the red blanket found in Adrian's apartment, the knife still marked with her blood, and the jeans and shirt bearing traces he had tried but failed to wash away. Each piece of evidence was a thread, and together they wove a rope that tied him to Natalie's death beyond any reasonable doubt. Witnesses took the stand one by one. Olivia Hayes, her voice trembling, described the scream in the early morning, the barking of Bella, and the sight of Adrian leaping from Natalie's burning window. A neighbor from Fresno recounted how Adrian had bragged about the murder afterward, sharing details that had never been released. The man who collected recyclables identified Adrian as the stranger who asked if he knew how to fight that same morning, before walking toward the sorority building. Each testimony hammered the same conclusion: Adrian had been there and Adrian had killed. The defense had little to offer. They tried to cast doubt on Olivia's memory, suggesting the chaos of smoke and flames could have confused her. They argued that DNA might have been transferred indirectly, that others could have used Adrian's car or clothing. But the jury could see the contradictions for themselves. Adrian's own words had betrayed him, his shifting stories unraveling under cross-examination. When prosecutors asked why his belongings carried Natalie's blood if he had never been in her room, Adrian had no answer. After weeks of testimony, the trial moved to closing arguments. Prosecutors reminded the jury of Natalie's life, her dedication to her studies, her kindness, her future cut short. They emphasized Adrian's choices: to break into her room, to stab her 19 times, to try and erase it all with fire. The defense urged the jury to consider doubt, but their words fell flat against the weight of evidence. Deliberations lasted less than a day. The jury filed back into the courtroom, faces solemn. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, Natalie's mother clutched her husband's hand, tears streaming down her face. A quiet sob rippled through the gallery of students. Adrian stared straight ahead, expressionless, as though the reality had yet to settle on him. Sentencing came on September 21st, exactly 3 years to the day after Natalie was killed. The symbolism was not lost on anyone present. The judge's voice was steady as he pronounced the punishment: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He noted that throughout the trial, Adrian had never once expressed remorse. Not a word of apology, not a flicker of regret. This court, the judge said, cannot restore the life that was taken. But it can ensure that the man responsible will never walk free again. For Natalie's family, the sentence brought a measure of relief, but also a hollow ache. Justice had been served, but their daughter was still gone. In interviews after the trial, her father said, "We're grateful that he can never hurt anyone else. But there will always be an empty seat at our table, always a birthday we can't celebrate with her." Questions remained, lingering like smoke long after the fire was out. Olivia often wondered what might have happened if police had checked Natalie's room more thoroughly when she first called about the scream. The timeline suggested Adrian was still inside, possibly even holding Natalie at knife point, when officers walked the halls and found nothing. Could she have been saved if they had opened that door? The uncertainty gnawed at her, a burden she carried in silence. Natalie's parents asked the same question many times in the years that followed. They criticized the police for not doing more, for not recognizing the signs. The department maintained that there had been no visible evidence of danger at the time. No forced entry, no sounds of a struggle. Without stronger cause, they said, they could not intrude further. The explanation did little to ease the family's pain. As for Ethan Delgado, his story ended differently. Having accepted a plea deal earlier, he served 2 years and 8 months for being an accessory and for burglary. By the time Adrian's trial concluded, Ethan was already months into his sentence. For some, it felt unjust. A young woman murdered, and one of the men present that night would walk free in a few short years. But prosecutors defended the decision, pointing out that Ethan's cooperation had helped secure the conviction of the true killer. In Riverside, the charred apartment building was eventually repaired and reoccupied, but for many students it remained a haunted place. Some refused to live there, unwilling to sleep in rooms where they knew Natalie had taken her last breaths. Memorials continued each year on the anniversary of her death, candles flickering in the night as students whispered prayers and promises to remember. Adrian Flores began his life sentence in a state penitentiary, his arrogance finally stripped away by walls that would hold him until his last breath. Reports from correctional officers painted him as quiet, withdrawn, a man who kept to himself. If he felt guilt, he never voiced it. For Natalie's family, the grief became part of their daily rhythm. They honored her memory through scholarships in her name, helping other young women pursue the education she never had the chance to complete. They spoke at college safety events, warning students about the dangers of complacency, urging universities to do more. Yet no matter how many steps they took, one question would never leave them. Had Natalie been alive when officers first entered the building? Was she still fighting, still hoping for rescue, only to be silenced by a man who waited for the police to leave? That question became the cruelest wound of all, a mystery no evidence could resolve. The case of Natalie Morgan stood as a reminder that evil often hides in plain sight. It rides in the same cars we pass on the street, it lives in apartments filled with textbooks and posters, it wears the ordinary face of a fellow student. And sometimes, it tries to burn away the truth. But the truth has a way of surviving, in the smoke that clings, in the blood that refuses to wash away, and in the memories of those who refuse to forget.